Welcome. In this video we're going to talk about two different Volvo staff cars. This one, the Volvo TP21, has become extremely popular among collectors the last years, and I will in this video take you through the history, and also we're going to take a ride in this fantastic vehicle. But before we begin with the history of this one, we need to go back in time to Second World War and look at the vehicle that was developed during the war by Volvo. So we will start there. During the Second World War, Swedish Army used a lot of vehicles that was developed during the 1930s, and during the war they realized we need to have more suitable vehicles for the task. So Volvo and Scania got the task to develop more modern, more suitable vehicles to tow artillery pieces, etc. And they also bought from abroad vehicles. The staff vehicles that they had were more or less ordinary cars, civilian cars that had been repainted and equipped with radio. Ordinary cars with no off-road capability at all. Mainly Volvo or American brands were used, and they realized we need to have something that at least can be able to travel off-road when needed. So Volvo got the task to develop a new staff car that could travel off-road and be able to carry 4 to 6 people inside the vehicle. And the result is this, the Volvo TPV, terrängpersonvagn, model 43. That was the name for it. And Volvo had a young engineer who had been involved in another project before, and that was to copy the German 1-ton half-track that had been used in Sweden, and Sweden needed more half-tracks, but they were not able to buy them from Germany, so they decided we need to copy. So they made a special Swedish Volvo HBT half-track that was designed. And that guy, Måns Hartelius, now became the project manager for this vehicle, and this was the first vehicle that he was in charge of on his own. In order to make a vehicle that was quick and not so very expensive to create, they looked what do we have, what parts, what designs that we already have used could we use in this one. So they used parts from what they already had in stock, and the chassis came from the small truck, the LV101, and the body, the cabin was from a taxi cab, the PV801. So they used parts that they already had. The rear axle from the truck they used and modified it to become the front axle of this vehicle. So by doing that they created a 4x4 vehicle that could go off-road, and that was the first SUV made by Volvo. 207 in total produced for the military between 1944 and 1946. Not all these cars were equipped with radio from the beginning, but the ones that were, they had a more powerful generator and an extra battery. It's still 6-volt electrical system. The roof was open with canvas, so you could use to open up for air surveillance, or if the commander of the unit would like to stand up and had a better view over the battlefield. So this was something that you could open up all the way. They used the Volvo ED engine, a 6-cylinder petrol engine, together with a manual gearbox. And since this is a 4x4 vehicle, they needed to have a transfer case that was specially designed for this kind of vehicle. So it had the propeller shafts in both directions, for the front and rear axle. So that was something new for the vehicle. The rest is more or less standard components that I used. A manual 4-speed gearbox, but no high-low range, so only 4-speed. You could connect or disconnect the front axle, and the rear axle had a differential lock that was quite useful when you're doing off-road driving. But the designers put the lever for the differential lock down here, and on Volvo cars at the time, that was the place where you had the handle for the parking brake. So there were a lot of rear axle that was totally destroyed because people were using the parking brake and did not know it was for the differential lock. So there's a sign. This is not the parking brake. Parking brake is on the other side. Not very comfortable seats, and these seats, they were not designed for this vehicle. They actually used the same seats that were taken out from another car, the German Tempo Vidal Geländewagen, and I think it's the most uncomfortable seats I have ever used. It's absolutely a nightmare to drive this vehicle. The off-road performance for this vehicle was not the very best, and that was because of the long distance, more than 3 meters between the front and the rear axle. But still a lot better than the ordinary standard cars that they had at the time with only rear axle drive. By the beginning of the 1950s, the army needed to have a bit more modern vehicles, and the vehicles that they had bought after the Second World War as surplus from the US, some of them were worn out, and so they needed a bit more modern fleet. And Volvo, with Mr. Haltelius, once again got the task to develop a new staff car, a bit more modern, and they used experience from the earlier one, the TPV. So this one, the TP21 Radiopersonterrängbil 915, as it was called in the Swedish army, a radio vehicle 915. It had bigger wheels, stronger axles, shorter wheelbase, and was a lot more comfortable to ride in. The only thing that they kept from the earlier TPV was, in fact, the engine. A bit modified, but still the same ED engine from the 1940s. And the axles now had differential locks on both front and rear, which was a big improvement. High and low range gearbox as well. So this vehicle became a much more suitable off-road vehicle, and in many cases you can say that this was actually a very good off-road vehicle, and you could compare it with many of the others that were on the market at the time. In total, 720 vehicles were produced between 1953 and 1958. They also tried to sell this on the civilian market, so they actually made 2 prototypes of a civilian version of this one. And we think that both these prototypes still today survived. You could compare that one with the Volvo XC90 that came many years later. So Volvo thought way ahead of its time back then. Antennas on the side, on the roof, and later on when they modified this vehicle with new modern radios, they also had to add another antenna on the left side of the vehicle. So depending on what kind of radio was in, they had different types of antenna on it. Up here there is a flexible hose that was used to connect to the exhaust pipe. When you're standing still with the vehicle and the engine running, listening to the radios, you didn't want to have the exhaust coming into the cabin of the vehicle. So you had this hose on the exhaust pipe so you could lead off the exhaust a couple of meters off the vehicle. And that actually helped a lot instead of having all these fumes inside the vehicle. So a very handy equipment to have. At the rear you could carry 2 extra fuel cans. It's a radio car, and standing with the engine running all day, the fuel consumption goes up, so you need to have extra petrol so you can travel until where you can refuel next time. You also had a rack for equipment, or which was commonly used to have 2 bicycles. So it was a very practical vehicle, a very reliable and popular vehicle. Out of the 720 built, many of them survived, sold out to civilian collectors, and many of them were used as off-road vehicles, and they were changing engines and gearboxes, etc. And the few remaining with the original specification, with original engine, radio equipment, etc., are today very popular. And now I will take you for a ride in this lovely vehicle with original petrol engine. Out in the open, a fantastic spring day, and it's time to take this lovely vehicle for a spin. So let's go for a ride. Four-wheel drive, high-low range, gearbox, handbrake, and a lot of buttons. Normally it's perfectly okay to start in second gear. And since it's an old type of crash box, you need to use the clutch twice when changing gears. And when you're going down, you need to use the accelerator a bit in order to get the engine and gearbox revolutions to fit. Otherwise it will be very difficult to change gears. So that's a special type of technique that we learned in the old days. And they're all different, so you need to get used to each individual vehicle. Fantastic vehicle to drive, and I love this original side valve engine. And you can easily use second and third in most situations. And the low range is, well, it's very useful to have, but normally it's perfectly okay to use high range. We could try and see. So this is first gear, low range, which is well, you can almost climb trees. the third gear in this particular vehicle is a bit difficult, so you need to find the perfect alignment from gearbox to engine to get them into gears. So sometimes you double clutch and sometimes you need to use the accelerator also a bit, even if that's not normal when changing up. A lot of people in Sweden, when they bought the second hand from the army, they threw out the original engine and put a bigger petrol or diesel engine in, which they think is more powerful and economical, which it could be. But I love this original engine. And today a lot of people regret what they did, so they trying to find the original engine to put back in again and to restore it as the original military specifications and not using it as a mud monster with a big V8 engine in it. You can barely hear the engine, the 6-cylinder side valve engine. It's just so wonderful quiet. This vehicle was a lot more comfortable than the TPV, the predecessor. Better seats. It also had the possibility with high road range and in and out front axle. Differential locks for both front and rear axle. And like many cars in the old days, this chain for the curtain in front of the radiators, you could, during winter time, you could block the radiator and not get the cold air in there for cooling down the engine too quickly. It's possible to open up the windscreen, and this is something that is quite useful when you do driving during night, and to avoid the reflections in the windshield, so you can have a better view out from the vehicle when it's pitch dark. A lot more easy to drive with the open window. In the rear seats there can be two radio operators, and not bad at all. It's quite comfortable. Different radios depending on which period of time this vehicle was used, and they were changed over the years, including the antennas. You can switch on the radios and hear if you hear the sound of the radios. You can talk to the different units and also use the Morse key up here. Power supply under the table, speakers at the rear. So well, it's not bad at all. It's a very nice car. And of course sometimes you need to blindfold this area back here, so you can sit in the vehicle with blindfolded windows when you need to have the light on during nighttime, so it won't light out and the enemy will spot where the vehicle is. You can use this as a map table or writing table. A lot of small different details. There's a nice background sound from the radio equipment, and then of course you have the engine running and 2 or 3 different channels chatting with communication. So within this space there could be a lot of noise going on all the time, so it can be quite relaxing if you are a radio operator or a commander of some unit sitting back here for long hours. It's fantastic to be able to go outside and have a break for some minutes. That was the Volvo TP21, or 915 as it's called in the Swedish army. Sugga. A lovely vehicle to drive and to ride. Fantastic vehicle. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you like our films, please subscribe, and see you next time. Nej! Soppatorsk tror jag. Bad planning, ran out of gas.
Jag tror du ska stänga av.
Once again.